What would you do if the person you love most was torn from your arms and dragged into chains? In 1827, deep in the untamed wilderness of the American frontier, one Sioux woman faced this nightmare. Armed with nothing but a ceremonial hatchet and the ancient wisdom of her ancestors, Awanata would prove that love knows no bounds, and that justice sometimes comes at the edge of a blade. This is the story of how 5 slave hunters learned too late that they had captured the wrong man's wife. If stories of courage and justice in the Old West captivate you, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon, because today's tale will leave you breathless until the very last word. The morning mist clung to the forest floor, like ghostly fingers, as Awanata knelt beside the stream, filling her water pouch. The sound of rushing water masked the approaching danger until it was too late. Her husband, Takoda, had been gathering medicinal herbs just 50 yards away when the first gunshot shattered the peaceful dawn. "Awanata, run!" Takoda's voice cut through the air, but she could already hear the thunder of horses and the shouts of white men. She pressed herself against a massive oak, her heart pounding as she watched 5 mounted men surround her husband. Their leader, a scarred man with tobacco-stained teeth, dismounted with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice thick with a southern accent. "Look what we got here, boys. A fine specimen, strong back, good teeth. He'll fetch a pretty price down in New Orleans." "Please," Takoda said in broken English, his hands raised. "I am free, man. I have papers." The leader's backhand sent Takoda sprawling. "Papers don't mean nothing out here, Redskin. You're property now." Awanata bit her lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself to remain hidden as they bound her husband's hands with rough rope. Every instinct screamed at her to charge forward, but her grandmother's teachings echoed in her mind. "Patience, little wolf. The hunter who strikes too early feeds the vultures." "Boss, what if someone comes looking for him?" asked a younger man with nervous eyes. "Who's gonna look? These savages disappear all the time. Besides, we'll be long gone before anyone notices." But the leader spat into the dirt. "Chain him up with the others." Others? Awanata's blood ran cold as she realized this wasn't an isolated incident. These men were part of something larger, more sinister. As the slave hunters mounted their horses and rode deeper into the forest, Awanata emerged from her hiding spot. Her hands trembled as she touched the ceremonial hatchet at her belt, a weapon passed down through generations of her family. The polished stone head gleamed in the dappled sunlight, and she could almost hear her ancestors whispering their strength into her soul. She had 2 choices: ride to the nearest fort for help, knowing Takoda would be long gone by the time she returned, or follow them herself. The decision took less than a heartbeat. Awanata began to track them, moving through the forest like a shadow. Her moccasins made no sound on the forest floor, and her knowledge of the land gave her advantages these white men couldn't imagine. She knew every game trail, every hidden path, every place where the trees grew thick enough to conceal an approach. As the day wore on, she learned their patterns. The leader, who the others called Morrison, was arrogant and careless. The nervous young one, Jimmy, jumped at every sound. The other 3 were seasoned but lazy, more interested in their whiskey than watching for threats. When they made camp that evening, Awanata positioned herself in the branches of an ancient pine, close enough to hear their conversation but hidden by the thick needles. "How many we got now, Morrison?" asked a grizzled man with a grey beard. "Counting the new one, 7. Should be enough for a good payday." Morrison poked at the fire with a stick. "We'll rest here tonight, then push hard tomorrow. Want to reach the river by sunset." "What about his woman? She might cause trouble." Morrison laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "One squaw against 5 armed men? I'd like to see her try." In the darkness above, Awanata's grip tightened on her hatchet. "You will," she thought grimly. "Sooner than you think." The slave hunters had made a fatal error. They had underestimated the bond between Awanata and Takoda, and they had no understanding of what a Sioux woman was capable of when protecting her family. As the men settled into their bedrolls around the dying fire, Awanata descended from her perch like a hunting cat. The forest was her domain, and she moved through it with supernatural grace, every step calculated, every breath controlled. Her first target was their horses. Without mounts, the slave hunters would be trapped in unfamiliar territory. She approached the animals slowly, speaking to them in the ancient tongue her grandmother had taught her. Horses, she knew, could sense intention, and hers was pure. One by one she cut their tethers and led them away into the darkness. The animals followed willingly, as if they understood they were being liberated from evil men. She guided them to a hidden valley 2 miles away, where they would be safe but impossible for the hunters to find quickly. Returning to the camp, Awanata began the psychological warfare that would precede the physical confrontation. She moved around their perimeter like a ghost, leaving signs that would unnerve them. An arrow stuck in a tree just outside the firelight. A handful of pebbles scattered on Morrison's bedroll, the faint sound of her war song carried on the night wind. Jimmy was the first to wake, his young nerves already frayed. "Morrison," he whispered urgently, shaking his leader's shoulder. "Morrison, wake up." "What is it, boy?" Morrison growled, his hand instinctively reaching for his pistol. "Something's wrong. The horses. They're gone." Morrison bolted upright, and within moments all 5 men were awake and armed. They searched the area frantically, their torches casting wild shadows that made every tree look like a potential threat. "Indians," spat the grey-bearded man. "Has to be. They took our horses." "How many you think?" asked another. Morrison studied the ground, but Awanata had been careful to leave no clear tracks. "Could be a whole war party. We need to stay together, stay alert." "What about the cargo?" Jimmy's voice cracked with fear. "The slaves stay chained. We'll move on foot if we have to." Morrison's jaw was set with determination, but Awanata could see the worry in his eyes. Double the watch. Nobody sleeps alone. But Awanata wasn't finished with her psychological assault. Throughout the night, she continued her campaign of terror. A rope would snap mysteriously, sending their makeshift shelter crashing down. Their water barrels would develop holes, forcing them to ration their remaining supplies. Strange sounds echoed through the forest. The call of a night bird that wasn't quite right, the snap of a twig that suggested movement just beyond their vision. By dawn, the slave hunters were exhausted and paranoid. They had barely slept, jumping at every sound, arguing among themselves about what to do next. "We should head back," Jimmy pleaded. "This place is cursed." "Shut your mouth," Morrison snapped. "It's just Indians trying to spook us. We've dealt with worse." But even Morrison's confidence was shaken when they discovered that their food supplies had been contaminated during the night. Someone had mixed dirt and leaves into their flour, spoiled their salt pork, and poured sand into their coffee. "This is more than just trying to spook us," the grey-bearded man said quietly. "Someone's trying to kill us slow." Awanata watched from her concealment, satisfied with the fear she saw in their eyes. But she wasn't just trying to frighten them. She was studying them, learning their weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the morning progressed and the men prepared to move their captives on foot, Awanata made her final preparations. She had identified the order in which she would take them. Jimmy first, because his fear made him careless. Then the 2 middlemen, whose names she hadn't learned. The greybeard would be fourth, because despite his experience he was slowing down with age. Morrison would be last. She wanted him to see his men fall, to understand the price of his cruelty before she sent him to join his ancestors in whatever dark place awaited men like him. The ceremonial hatchet felt warm in her hand, as if it were alive with the spirits of her warrior ancestors. Today, it would taste blood in defense of family and justice. The hunt was about to become a reckoning. The slave hunters moved through the forest like wounded animals, constantly looking over their shoulders, their formation tight but brittle with tension. They had fashioned crude stretchers to carry their supplies and forced their captives to help bear the load. But progress was slow, and their nerves were fraying with each passing hour. Awanata shadowed them from the canopy above, moving from tree to tree with the fluid grace of someone born to the forest. She had painted her face with mud and charcoal in the traditional war patterns of her people, and her dark eyes burned with righteous fury. The first strike came when the group paused to rest beside a narrow creek. Jimmy had wandered slightly apart from the others to relieve himself, his rifle carelessly propped against a tree. Awanata dropped from the branches above like a falling star. The young man never had a chance to scream. Awanata's hatchet found its mark with surgical precision, and Jimmy crumpled silently to the forest floor. She dragged his body into the thick underbrush and took his weapons before melting back into the green shadows. It was nearly 10 minutes before Morrison noticed Jimmy's absence. "Where's the boy?" he barked, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Thought he was with you," replied one of the unnamed hunters. They found Jimmy's rifle, but no sign of the young man himself. Morrison's face went pale as he realized what this meant. They weren't just being stalked by random Indians. Someone was hunting them specifically, and that someone was very, very good. "Form up!" Morrison shouted. "Nobody goes anywhere alone. We move as one unit from now on." But Awanata had anticipated this response. She had spent the morning preparing the forest itself as her weapon, setting snares and deadfalls along the most likely paths. When the slave hunters resumed their march, they walked directly into her web. The second man fell when a carefully balanced log, triggered by a nearly invisible tripwire, came crashing down from the trees above. The impact was devastating, and his screams echoed through the forest before cutting off abruptly. Now the remaining 3 men were in full panic. They abandoned any pretense of an orderly march and began running through the forest, dragging their captives behind them. But fear made them careless, and Awanata used their desperation against them. She appeared suddenly on their left flank, her war cry piercing the air as she charged from behind a massive boulder. The third hunter spun toward the sound, raising his rifle, but Awanata was already moving. Her hatchet caught him in the chest, and he fell backward into the creek with a splash that seemed to echo forever. "There!" Morrison screamed, pointing at Awanata as she vanished back into the forest. "It's just one woman!" One woman! But knowing their enemy's identity didn't make her any less deadly. The gray-bearded hunter, whose name was Caleb, tried to take charge of the situation. "We need to get to open ground," he panted. "She's using the trees against us." They stumbled toward a small clearing ahead, but Awanata was already there, waiting. She had positioned herself in the branches of a dead oak that overlooked the space, and as the 2 remaining hunters entered the clearing, she dropped down behind them. Caleb turned just in time to see death approaching. Awanata's hatchet moved in a silver arc, and the old hunter fell without a word. Morrison was alone now, his eyes wild with terror and rage. He still had his pistol, and he swung it toward Awanata with desperate speed. "You savage witch!" he screamed. "I'll kill you for this." But Awanata was no longer the hidden predator stalking from the shadows. She stood in the center of the clearing, her hatchet gleaming in the dappled sunlight, her war paint making her look like an avenging spirit risen from the earth itself. "You took my husband," she said in perfect English, her voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "You steal my people. You sell them like animals." Morrison's hand shook as he aimed his pistol. "They ain't people. They're property. It's legal." "Not here," Awanata replied, and her voice was as cold as winter wind. "Here, There is only justice. Morrison pulled the trigger, but his fear had ruined his aim. The bullet went wide, and before he could reload, Awanata was moving. She covered the distance between them in 3 fluid strides, her hatchet singing through the air. Morrison fell to his knees, then forward onto his face. The forest fell silent, except for the sound of wind in the leaves and the distant call of a mourning dove. Awanata stood among the bodies of the 5 slave hunters, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The ceremonial hatchet in her hand was no longer just a symbol of her heritage. It had become an instrument of justice, baptized in the blood of those who would enslave her people. But her work was not finished. Takoda and the other captives were still chained, still waiting for rescue. Awanata moved quickly to free the captives, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Takoda was the first she reached, and when their eyes met, she saw a mixture of relief, pride, and deep love that made her heart soar. "My brave wife," he whispered, as she worked to unlock his shackles with keys taken from Morrison's body. "I knew you would come." "Always," she replied simply, and the word carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. The other captives, 6 Native Americans from various tribes, watched in amazement as their rescuer worked. Among them was an elderly Cheyenne medicine man named White Eagle, a young Crow woman named Singing Bird, and 4 warriors from different bands who'd been taken in separate raids. "Sister," White Eagle said softly, "the spirits guided your hand today. You have done a great thing." But as Awanata searched through Morrison's belongings, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Hidden in his saddlebags were documents, letters, maps, and ledgers that revealed the true scope of the operation she had stumbled upon. "Takoda!" she called urgently. "Look at this." The papers detailed a vast network of slave traders operating throughout the frontier territories. Morrison and his men were just one small part of a larger organization that had been systematically capturing Native Americans and selling them to plantations in the Deep South. The documents contained names, locations, and even schedules for future raids. "There are others," Takoda said grimly, studying a map marked with red X's. "Many others, and they plan to hit the Lakota camp near Bear Creek in 3 days. Singing Bird, who had been listening, stepped forward. "My brother is at that camp. My children." The weight of this revelation settled on Awanata like a heavy blanket. She had saved her husband and these 6 people, but hundreds more were in danger. The documents showed that the slave trade in Native Americans was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, and it was growing bolder. "We have choices," White Eagle said quietly. "We can take these papers to the authorities, hope they will act. We can warn our people and hope they can defend themselves, or we can stop them ourselves," Awanata finished. The group fell silent as they considered the implications. They were 8 people against what appeared to be a network of dozens of slave traders, backed by wealthy plantation owners and corrupt officials. "I will not run," Awanata declared. "I will not hide while our people are hunted like animals. These men think we are weak, that we will not fight back. Today, I showed them how wrong they are." Takoda placed his hand on his wife's shoulder. "If you fight, I fight beside you." One by one, the other freed captives voiced their agreement. Even knowing the odds against them, they chose to stand and fight rather than flee to safety. "Then we need a plan," White Eagle said, "and we need allies." Over the next several hours, as they made camp in a hidden valley, the group studied the captured documents and formulated their strategy. The papers revealed that the slave traders would be gathering at a remote trading post called Devil's Fork in 5 days to coordinate their next series of raids. It would be their best chance to strike at the heart of the operation, but they would need help. Awanata proposed reaching out to other tribes, to sympathetic white settlers who opposed slavery, and even to some of the army officers who might be willing to act against the traders if presented with evidence. "It will be dangerous," Dakota warned. "If we fail, if even one of us is captured." "Then we make sure we don't fail," Awanata replied, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "We make sure that when people tell this story, they remember that we fought back, that we refused to be victims." As the night deepened around their small camp, the 8 survivors began to plan their war against the slave traders. They would use the same tactics that had served Awanata so well in the forest: stealth, surprise, and the intimate knowledge of the land that was their birthright. The ceremonial hatchet lay beside Awanata as she slept, and in her dreams she could hear the voices of her ancestors singing songs of war and justice. Tomorrow, they would begin gathering their forces for the fight ahead. The slave hunters had thought they were capturing property. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous, the righteous fury of a people who would no longer suffer in silence. Morrison and his men had learned too late that some bonds cannot be broken by chains, and some spirits cannot be conquered by cruelty. Their deaths in that forest clearing would be remembered not as a tragedy, but as the first blow in a larger war for freedom and dignity. And at the center of it all stood Awanata, the Sioux woman who had killed 5 slave hunters with a hatchet to save her husband, and in doing so had lit a fire that would burn until every chain was broken and every slaver brought to justice. The forest had witnessed the birth of a legend, and the legend was just beginning. 3 months later, the trading post at Devil's Fork lay in ruins, its slave trading operation completely destroyed. The network that had terrorized Native American communities across the frontier was broken, its leaders either dead or fleeing to distant territories. The documents recovered from Morrison's camp had provided the evidence needed to convince both tribal councils and federal authorities to take action. Awanata and Dakota returned to their people as heroes, but more importantly, they returned as symbols of resistance and hope. The story of the Sioux woman who killed 5 slave hunters with a hatchet spread from tribe to tribe, inspiring others to stand up against oppression and fight for their freedom. The ceremonial hatchet was eventually placed in a place of honor in their lodge. But its work was done. Justice had been served, love had triumphed over hatred, and the forest had reclaimed the blood of the wicked, washing it clean with spring rains and covering it with new growth. Some say that on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the trees where Morrison and his men fell, you can still hear the echo of Awanata's war cry, a reminder that courage and love can overcome even the darkest evil, and that some spirits are too strong to ever be enslaved. If this tale of courage and justice moved you, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from the American frontier. Hit that notification bell, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Awanata's place? The Old West was full of heroes whose stories deserve to be told, and we're just getting started.